My name is Megan Bever, and I am here today as the book review editor for the Journal of the Civil War Era. Joining me is Maria Angela Diaz, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. She is a Civil War era Southern historian, and she also specializes in the history of imperialism and the Caribbean. So, specifically, we are here today to talk about her book, A Continuous State of War: Empire Building and Race Making in the Civil War Era Gulf South, which was published in 2024 by the University of Georgia Press's On Civil Wars series. So, welcome, Angela.
Thank you. Thank you for
I'm
having me.
yes, I'm really glad you could join me today. So could you start by telling us a little bit how you became interested in studying U.S. expansion into the Gulf South?
Yeah, usually when I start my book talks, I oftentimes talk about my own personal journey to actually publishing this book and its inspiration. And that comes from, several different things, but it primarily comes from my own kind of lived experience as, a Latina, a Mexican woman, living in the South and in very many parts of the South and engaging with white Southerners throughout my life in a way that usually caused some kind of questions and confusions on the part of especially white Southerners when they engaged with me. And so, I oftentimes say when I get to graduate school, it's not any wonder that as a Southern historian, I became very interested in why and how Southerners in the modern day view Latin American people in this like, well, you're not black, you're not white, you may be a combination of various I don't, what are you? That big question of what are you? And so I decided to kind of marry that with my interest in the Civil War era in general and look at some of the origins of these questions and curiosities that I was oftentimes met with. Most of them were kind, some of them not so much, but yeah, so that's kind of what drew me there to the interest. And then also my advisor, Bill Link, I did my master's paper on Texas. And when I was getting ready to do my dissertation, he said, you can't just write about Texas. You have to write about something bigger. And in my brain, I was like, what's bigger than Texas? So, so I went with I was very interested in the Gulf Coast and all of the states along the Gulf Coast. So that's where it comes from.
So to build on that a little bit, the book very much does have a Gulf South framing,
Mhm.
um and it provides it felt different to me reading it than other books. I mean, you do a lot with Texas, and Texas
Mhm.
so often gets put in like a Western framework,
Right.
especially if we're thinking about expansion and empire. So how does that Gulf focus and that framework
Mhm.
provide us a different point of view for looking at 19th century US imperialism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of really great work out there that's being done and that has been done about, Texas and US imperialism and expansion and also just US imperialism and expansion during the early to mid 19th century. One of the things that I wanted to do was I was sort of looking for a place where all of it kind of converged, where aspects of the West, aspects of Southern history, Latin American history, all kind of comes together. And to me, when I was looking at the Gulf South, I was thinking this is the place. This is the place where all of these things, and in the Gulf of Mexico in general, you have historical forces coming from the Atlantic world, from the Caribbean, from Latin America, the West, the South. And so it was a picture of the United States during this period that to me was very interesting because what you could do is you could look at international, national, regional, and then finally local experiences of all of these really big forces that are shaping American history during the Civil War era. And so, it was to me, it was the best bang for my buck. I mean, it's such a, and also the communities of the Gulf South are so rich in terms of ethnic and racial diversity, imperial structures that are still kind of lingering on in the mid 19th century, the French, the Spanish, even the British. All of those things are at play. And then also, still the presence of indigenous people, Native Americans in Florida and even along, places like Alabama. It's sort of like the last parts of the southeastern Indian removal. And all of those things are things that I can touch on that aren't typically touched on when we talk about perhaps Southern imperialism or American imperialism during this period. So yeah, that's what what drew me to the Gulf Coast.
So race making is in the title, and
Hmm.
one of the components of this that you return to over and over in the book is that you argue that white supremacy, and so and you've already alluded to this, but there's white dominance over indigenous people, black people, Spanish-speaking peoples. So it's the dominance and also the ability to shape and control movement of
Hmm.
non-white people that is part of white supremacy, and this is central to expansion. So,
Hmm.
could you talk about the ways that this plays out in the Gulf South?
Yeah, so, like I'd said, the looking at the Gulf South gives us an ability to look very deeply at community levels and communities of different sizes and in different spaces, some more settled than others. I talk about New Orleans a lot, but I also talk about, the Texas Gulf Coast and even, into the Texas U.S. Mexico, what we would call the U.S. Mexico borderlands today, as well as the sort of Florida hinterlands, in different parts of Florida. And, one of the things um, that I think my book does and what it shows is the various ways that white Southerners, but also Americans, are using the military to, accomplish expansion and secure the territory of expansion. You know, I was surprised at how militaristic the Gulf Coast communities were, and how wedded they are to not just the Army, but also the Navy and the presence of the Navy. I mean, it's a coastline, so of course the Navy. But one of the things that I think is very interesting and that makes them so driven to control these groups of people and so driven to assert that white supremacy at every sort of turn is, the fear of threats to the system of slavery within the Gulf Coast, but also just this persistent feeling that these groups are unruly, that they are, undermining white supremacy in various ways, that even though the United States claims this territory, that authority doesn't filter all the way down to the bottom. And also the fears that another powerful European power might come in and, similar to like the War of 1812, take over, assert its own dominance. And so to me, that drive to control the movements of black people, Native Americans, even immigrants of varying ethnic groups, Spanish speaking peoples is in part about, fulfilling these desires and fantasies of expansion, but it's also about fear. It's also about what happens when slavery is threatened, when our commodities and economies are threatened. We have to assert real control over this space because ultimately we have paper control right now, but not real, honest to God control.
I want to follow up on you started in your that answer. You were talking a lot about sort of desires and fantasies,
Hmm.
and of course, this is one of the threads running through the
Hmm.
book is there's reality, and then there are all these white fantasies, and it's intertwined with expansion.
Right.
So how do their fantasies as they relate to expansion? How do those play out sort of before, during, and after the Civil War?
Yeah. So I would say we'll take before the Civil War, obviously. First, so before the Civil War, I would say that especially in like the 1830s, 1840s time period, Southerners of the Gulf South feel very much in lockstep with the goals of the wider goals of American expansion west, but the possibilities of American expansion southward into Mexico, into the Caribbean, even, into the 1850s. There's this persistent obsession on the part of the United States to control Cuba, and to annex Cuba. And those are things that they're very much, a part of. And they're very much these communities of the Gulf Coast are very much a part of, the Mexican War. And even, the Mexican War essentially begins, in the US Mexico borderlands of Texas, but also within the sort of coastal area. And those areas are very involved in those things. And so, the fantasies there are imperialistic, initially imperialistic, sort of conjoined with the overall idea that the United States itself one day can and should be an empire. But as we move, further into the very, tension-filled period of the 1850s, um, that idea that the South itself could assert its own imperialist desires and should, in order to protect itself, in order to, grow its economy, and grow its society, that also begins to take over more and more and more. Some of the specific things I look at, aside from like the Mexican War, is the rash of filibustering expeditions, which are these armed extra legal, or these armed, not legally sanctioned expeditions to especially Latin American countries to try to take them over for a variety of different reasons, or cause a revolution for a variety of different reasons. And New Orleans winds up being like a hotbed of that. Many of those leave from there. I look at the Cuban expeditions of a gentleman by the name of Narciso Lopez. And there's all different kinds of these sort of fantasies of like, we're going to grow all, that we're going to be growing cotton all the way into Mexico, and we're going to take over Cuba as a state, and it's going to have, the sugar industry is going to boom, and we'll have, the slave system will be secured, and we will have a nice balance in Congress because we have this new state of Cuba and possibly even Puerto Rico and all of these things. And so there is this kind of like feeling of like, okay, if we can create some sort of slave-based empire, we can, everything will be wonderful, everything will be perfect. And I always say that a lot of these fantasies are also speaking to the fears that I kind of mentioned earlier of, that we don't have as much control as we would like to have, that that our system and our society is under threat. Because we can never, I talk about the Gulf Coast, but we can never forget about the wider context that also includes the North, abolitionism, all of these things that make Southerners in general feel as though the sort of world is closing in on them. And Gulf South Southerners feel that, but also this sort of transnational fear of these unruly spaces kind of beneath them, these spaces that they want to control, and the fear of Europe as a dominant force. And then in the Civil War, I think that the Confederacy inherits a lot of those ideas of, a slave-based empire. And it has its own expansionist agenda, which oftentimes, in terms of the Civil War and how we teach it, we tend to forget that part. We talk about them as, wanting to perhaps assert being a nation, but they have bigger plans than that. And that's in our, that's a thing that's sort of driving them. What's interesting in the Gulf Coast region is that the reason I call the book A Continuous State of War is because that region is in a continuous state of conflict from the 1830s into the Civil War. But in the Civil War, what you get a lot of is, a lot, you do get conflict, you do get battles, quite famous battles, some of them, and, but you get this mass of refugees and displaced people sort of shifting back and forth, trying to go to Texas, sort of trapped kind of almost in the peninsula of Florida, and all of these things. New Orleans falls very early in the Civil War. It becomes controlled and occupied by the Union. You have an influx of Unionists there. So, there's all of this movement that I noticed. And so, during and as we head into the end of the Civil War, when things for Southerners start to get pretty desperate, um, many of them start to once again think about and fantasize about Latin America as being some sort of safe haven for them. And many of them do wind up going there. They wind up going there to Mexico, and wind up going to places like Cuba, Brazil, especially, where they are, trying to keep alive that notion of the South, of the slave South in some way, or just hoping to no longer, or just hoping to avoid being hanged for treason, all of those things. So, and those are, I think, fantasies of a different kind. To me, they seem like fantasies sort of born out of desperation of refugees. And that's essentially what they are. And isn't it? um, you know, isn't it so interesting that they start out in the book as conquerors and to me end up as refugees? And that's kind of, yeah, the sort of arc of that narrative.
This is sort of a follow-up and sort of a pivot.
Mhm.
But and in your answer and in your study as a whole, right, these dreams, very Southern, very white, and Confederate at times, up through the end of the war.
Mhm.
But I also think that your study plays really well with other recent scholarship on empire,
Mhm.
particularly that picks up in the late 19th century. So when I was reading the book, like I couldn't help making these connections and asking these questions. Like, do
Yeah.
you think that this dream, obviously the US gets rid of slavery
Right.
to
Yeah.
an extent, right? Not completely, um, after the war. But do you think the US picks up this whole dream during and after Reconstruction? Does that Gulf South dream become national or not?
Right.
Like, what's your take on that?
Well, interestingly enough, I'm currently writing an essay for an edited volume that talks about the idea of Greater Reconstruction, which is more of a U.S. Western history term, and it's in its relation to the Gulf South and sort of I think you're right. There's this really great line of books and thinking that's thinking about Reconstruction in different kind of contexts, transnational contexts, transcontinental contexts. And I think that for me, I think that the United States' desire to be an empire, to be this sort of massive continental power and force, that is something that rather than is inherited from the Gulf South, I think it's something that, continues apace in many ways. When I was first writing on this work and presenting on it, at a conference in the American Studies Association, my commenter noted, that slavery is done away with, but that desire for empire persists. And for me, the question then becomes, well, how do the people of the Gulf South reincorporate themselves into what is more of a national drive now? Because they were removed from the nation by the Confederacy. The Confederacy had its own ideas that were based in the perpetuation and expansion of slavery. Um, and now, how are they relating back again to this, this what's going to be, like you said, this late 19th century like desire for a Latin American empire? And I think that, what I've seen is that they're having to confront Reconstruction as we know it, as we're familiar with it, which is the Reconstruction policies and how they play out on the ground, but also like African American, political, mobilization and political thought and people, serving in office and all of these things. And so I'm, now learning how they might think about American imperialism. And it is a little different than how white Southerners might think about it. White Southerners in the Gulf Coast tend to be a little bit more cautious about it now, at least in the beginning of Reconstruction. But that, African Americans tend to think the United States has this potential to be a force that will end slavery in the rest of the slaveholding places in the Western Hemisphere. And so they're articulating a fantasy that's different than that, but it's still an imperialistic fantasy. Um, and So yeah, I mean, but once we get to like the presidency of Grant and his his interest in obtaining the Dominican Republic, but Gulf Southerners start talking about Cuban annexation yet again with a lot of people. They become, they're like, yes, we're going to finally get Cuba. This is finally going to happen. But then they also have to. That is tempered with the reality that even if they have Cuba, which still kind of has slavery is in flux during the 10 Years War, which is the first revolutionary kind of real stab at an attempt to gain independence in Cuba. But their fantasies are tempered by the reality that more than likely slavery is not going to persist in Cuba and that it's going to end. And that's not necessarily treated with joy by a lot of the white Southern press. It's treated more with questions and some even thinking maybe it'll be gradual emancipation and we can have a kind of slavery again. That's that's those that thinking still persists still. Hmm.
That's I guess not surprising. It's a remarkable the way
Yeah.
that the
Hmm.
thinking is able to persist and those fantasies are able to persist.
Hmm.
Thank you so much
Yeah.
for sharing some thoughts about your book with us. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you too.